So just to summarize a bit, one of the distinctions I want to make is what then do the different models have to say about this question or hypothesis of moving beyond dialectical thinking? And so one of the limitations, I think, of these models is that, so we have current models, and then we have the hypothetical territory that we would like to look in. And I think one of the, if I had to make a short list of what we could look to advance, is that in the current models, for example, you'll hear a lot about subject-object shifts. So there would be Keegan's statement that the subject of the previous level becomes the object of the subject of the next level. But nowhere in these models does the question arise, for example, is what is it for an object, for example, to be for a subject? And that's a much more Eastern question. So the model is inherently limited by the conventional assumptions of what a subject and object are. And so when you start to move into this territory and say, well, let me get underneath this assumption and ask a question, is what is it for an object to be an object for a subject? Then the whole foundation of what my inquiry is becomes much more complicated. Also, for example, we're looking at, in the current models, ego development and how the ego makes meaning. But we really don't ask the question or incorporate into these models, what is ego? In the first place, we just assume, there's an assumption that we are studying something that is identifiable and has a certain Western meaning, but that we've not delved into the question. The model is not subject to the question, what is ego? Okay? But these, I think, kind of questions move us to exploring new territory. There's this aspect that I mentioned early of complexification or sophistication of reasoning up toward principles. But there's no mention or study of this move in the other direction, which is to deeper ontological, we could call them principles, but the word principles seems to only mean higher and more complex. So deeper ontological principles, there in a sense can be simpler in a way, or more foundational. And so there's this whole direction of awareness that is not studied in conventional models. Conventional or current models have expressed a lot of, and described a lot around this issue of polarity. But in my opinion, the ultimate polarity that hasn't been looked at is the figure-ground relation, which we'll talk about in a subsequent video. But I believe that this is the foundational polarity for all the other polarities, and there's some mention of figure-ground reversals, but it's not something that moves in any of these developmental models. And I think that if these developmental models could see that this could move, then they would advance into new territory. there is obviously an incorporation of the developmental processes, but there's no attempt to rigorously tie these into evolutionary ones. And then even when there's a mention of evolution, and it, in my opinion, it's not rigorous, there's certainly no attempt to look at involutionary processes. And where even the case of looking at or incorporating into the inquiry of symbolic representation is brought in, there's certainly not much discussion about non-symbolic representation. Now, the word representation is probably problematic here, or so we might say non-symbolic presentation of self, let's say. Now, what could possibly drive development beyond these stages, if not polarity? Because we're saying that polarity is dialectic and dualistic, and the new stages won't be driven by that. So what would drive development beyond even polarity itself? And so we could look at this from the skills and task models, and they actually themselves offer this, and that is when you look at task complexity and you look at skill capacity, there in many cases what is seen is that the modern world presents a problem like this, that skills and tasks are not growing at the same rate. And so during this era, the skill capacity grew faster than the task, so we saw progress and we could solve problems. But in the modern era, and currently in this, we have crisis. Because the skills, even at a meta or cross-paradigmatic or systems of principles level, problems are not being solved. The problems are more complex than these highest levels can solve. And if it keeps going like that, this point of crisis will become a catastrophe. So even the people who are working on developmental models in this skill set inquiry have pointed out this problem. In terms of the negotiation of polarities, we will look at in the next video, which is kind of a feature video presentation, that the moving to the two highest levels creates an option of two different kinds of responses. And both of them are problematic because it creates a crisis of ego and an interest in ego transcendence. And in terms of the dialectical process of development outlined by Facetious. So this was mostly Fisher, Cook-Reuter, and Facetious. One of the problems is that the paradoxes that drive the dialectical eventually become apparent and recursive. And so those people enter into the higher stages of trying to understand and negotiate polarities. And so these are three crises that signify the end of development in this trajectory and the potential of development toward a completely new trajectory driven by these three very serious problems. One is a kind of an empirical world problem solving capacity that is lacking. One is a just a reasoning capability or explanation problem solving is lacking, and that brings us into actual crisis of personal individuals in a crisis of meaning.